Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hannah Zuberi and you're here for another episode of Justice for All Now. Thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Samsung Galaxy 19, Amazon Fire, Roku TV, and Apple TV. As Serbian nationalism rose in militant response, the war in Bosnia saw the rise of an extreme anti Muslim sentiment and the violence which led to the genocide of Bosnian Muslims during a period of 4 days in July of 1995. Today, we'll be discussing what led Serbians to such extreme expressions of nationalism and why such hateful attitudes began to manifest after Bosnia's declaration of independence in 1992. Joining us today is Arnesa Kustura. Arnesa is an activist, she's a writer, the author of Letters from Diaspora. She's a genocide researcher at Remembering Srebrenica in the United Kingdom. And she's a leading lecturer on fascism and genocide studies. For the past 15 years, she has devoted a great amount of effort on combating genocide, denialism, and ethnonationalism. I'm so excited to have her here talking to us, especially with genocides going on around the globe and the work that we do at Justice for All. We're really, really happy that you're here today to talk to us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum to you and to everyone watching.
So please tell us more about yourself. How did you get involved in the work that you currently do? Describe your work in a little bit more detail. Where did you grow up? Tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So I was born in Sarajevo before everything sort of happened. At the time it was still Yugoslavia. And, a few years into my life, Bosnia declared independence and the siege of Sarajevo started. And so I basically, my life was really, my childhood was pretty much molded entirely by the Bosnian War and genocide. My father he's a concentration camp survivor. My grandfather was killed in the war in concentration camps in Visegrad by Serbian paramilitary forces, as well as my uncle. We only found the remains of my grandfather in 2001. We still haven't found the remains of my uncle and many other actually family members and loved ones. My grandma was also murdered during the genocide. So was my godmother. So for me, it was a very natural thing because as a child, I knew what was happening, but I didn't really know why. So as I sort of grew into, becoming like a teenager, I had moved to the United States. So I lived through the war. I saw the post-war life and the post-genocide life, and it all became really fascinating to me. And I wanted to learn as much as possible about the genocide and about the war and about everything that was happening. And I started writing about it. I started talking about it. I decided to go to school to study psychology because everywhere around me were, fellow Bosnian Muslims who were refugees, who were dealing with an enormous amount of trauma that they weren't really getting help for. And from psychology, I ended up actually switching over to sociology and genocide studies. And I became involved in activism, actually, I don't know, when I was like 15 years old. It wasn't just Bosnia, it was the Iraq War. It was sort of everything that was happening around the world. I noticed certain patterns. And most importantly, I think all of the work that I was doing, whether it was just speaking out about it, writing, organizing commemoration events, doing the research and compiling the data, All of these things for me had a specific end goal in mind, and for that for me is obviously not to forget what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s, not to forget the genocides that took place, but most importantly, for other places to learn from us and for these things not to actually happen elsewhere.
And that leads me to this question that as we're commemorating the 25 years and reflecting on nationalism and fascism and how it's developed since, we found many genocide warning signs in different countries around the world. The 10 stages of genocide was put together by Genocide Watch, Dr. George Stanton's work on that. So what do you think were the first signs of genocide against Bosniaks in Srebrenica?
So one misconception that a lot of people have is that the genocide only took place in July of 1995 and that it was a sort of cut and done deal. That's the biggest misconception. The genocide actually started really at the beginning of the war. It was sort of because that was a war of aggression, and the Serbian leadership, they had these very clear goals in mind that were in fact used at the ICTY to prove genocidal intent. You have people like Radovan Karadzic, who's on the phone with Serbian leadership in Belgrade saying things like, in 3 days, 500,000 Muslims in Sarajevo are going to be killed. And the other guy is saying, good, slaughter them all. You have them in 91 saying, what was it? Ratko Mladic himself saying, this is genocide, specifically encoded. So Srebrenica was not an outlier. It was the worst of it. It was the pinnacle of the inhumanity. But this was a process that really lasted several years, and you could sort of see it ongoing, and you could really see it after Tito's death and sort of the fall of communism. Slobodan Milosevic was grasping at power, and he did it through utilizing nationalist rhetoric. So the first thing that it started with was back in the 80s, and it was really with that sort of anti-Muslim propaganda. It was a lot of they're terrorists, they're going to get you, they're extremists, if you don't defend yourself, they will all your daughters will wear hijabs. It was a lot of stuff like in media and like the radio and stuff like that. So it's not slow. I mean, for example, today we are commemorating the anniversary of the genocide that took place in Prijedor, which is in northwest Bosnia. That place, almost 50,000 Bosniak Muslims were ethnically cleansed. Over 3,000 were definitely murdered. There was four or five concentration camps in just that small area alone. It's one of the most notable places for mass graves where hundreds and hundreds of remains have been located. And even today, 28 years after 1992 and 1993, 6 people got buried just today. Due to the fact that they weren't able to locate their mass remains. And then you look at places like Visegrad, where it was, again, a small town, small area, within 3 months, completely ethnically cleansed. There were no more Muslims in that area. These were people who had been living there for centuries. My own family is actually, half of my family is from there. Their homes were completely destroyed and taken over by the Serbian military. And so
and I remember that. I remember I was in college. That was my first year in college, and orphans were coming out of Bosnia, and there were these messages. We used to have IRC chat at that time. There was no Facebook or anything, and these messages were coming in that they're Muslim children, orphans, because of these mass genocide and like these massacres that had been taking place, and they needed people to adopt them before non-Muslims adopted them. So you saying that just triggered that memory. I remember we used to table at universities with and ask people to sign up to sponsor orphans.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah. So it was, it's all these things that really like led up to it. It was never going to be a singular attack. Their goal was always going to be to completely expand the Serbian state and expand their ideology and really cleanse the areas of Prijedor, of Visegrad, of Foča, of Srebrenica. And what happened at Srebrenica was certainly and by far the most inhumane of the crimes because of the extent of it.
mhm,
Um, but just looking at the entirety of Bosnia, their goal was always to really just destroy the Bosniak and the Muslim identity of that culture, of that
mhm,
country. They targeted the mosques, they targeted our cultural heritage, anything that was tied to us. I mean, Sarajevo, 90% of the buildings, whether they were mosques or cultural and historical heritage, was completely demolished.
mhm,
Over what, 11,000 to 15,000 people were murdered by sniper fire or shelling there. And like 379 times a day, they would specifically shell Muslim neighborhoods. Again, another thing that we have on videotape.
mhm,
What was it? Karadzic saying to people, target that neighborhood. There's,
mhm,
there's Muslims there. Even though Sarajevo was this multi-ethnic city,
mhm,
it didn't really matter. They were still going to target them where they knew were more Muslim areas.
okay.
So yeah, the genocide that happened in Srebrenica just sort of was the result of this initial aggression that started in 1992.
Mhm. I want to talk about, and you touched on it a little bit, and I want you to if you could expand on that, the way radio, media, newspapers were specifically used in spreading this ideology.
Mhm. Yeah, so again, we got to go back to really the 80s. It sort of started really slow.
Okay.
But you had, Serbian TV, they're the national TV of Serbia, RTS. They were basically completely um, the hand of Milosevic. So
Mm,
they spewed whatever propaganda they wanted. But then also in Bosnia itself, once Serbs entered a town or village or a municipality and they took it over, the first thing that they did was take over everything that was important, meaning police stations. So replace them with Serbian policemen if there were, too many Bosniaks there. So people were fired from government jobs.
mm,
And that also included media and journalists.
mm,
So they replaced them really with their own, and they allowed these journalists were basically a sort of a parrot of what Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic, and their sort of ilk wanted to say. So in places like Prijedor, one of the most infamous sort of case studies of the way media was really used was it first started with that sort of propaganda, and it was very Islamophobic. It
mm,
was very like, these are Bosniak nationalists, these are Islamo-fascists, these are Islamist extremists. They're all over Prijedor. You have to be a good
mm,
citizen, and you have to join up, and you have to take up, and you have to defend yourselves. So
mm,
it's this sort of constant thing. And then when they ended up turning the citizens of that area against the Muslim population, what they
mhm,
did was they even broadcasted things like, if you are a non-Serb, meaning if you're a Muslim, you are to
mhm.
identify yourself in your home with yourself with a white armband, your home
Oh,
with a flag. So that when the military actually did end up arriving, the Serbian military, they would know which homes to target and which people to actually take away to concentration camps and to, set them up for mass murder. So what happened in Bosnia was also, eliticide. They targeted important people who were
mm,
Muslim, judges, lawyers, police officers, um, and replaced them with their own, and journalists. And to the extent that the journalists went to concentration camps, right? And forced the Bosniak detainees in the concentration camps to basically say on radio, on television, that they were being treated well and that this was, not really a concentration camp. So the media played a huge role in
this is, and when you see the Chinese propaganda coming out, this is just
Mhm.
the same thing that they're pulling people out from concentration camps and saying, no, these are education camps. We're teaching them how to dance and sing, and teaching doctors and lawyers how to re-educating them because they have a mental disease called Islam. And it's fascinating to hear that these threads that are similar in genocide across. Please go ahead.
Oh no, absolutely. It is a tactic that leaders who want to control the population use very freely. We see it even in Western nations. It's definitely not something that's this sort of outlier to Eastern Europe or to the Middle East or to Latin America. It's something that is. It's media and journalists are such a powerful tool. And I don't think people even realize how powerful they are. So media and journalists in the Balkans, on one hand, we had these amazing journalists who were really putting themselves in harm's way, from local journalists in Sarajevo and even in Croatia, who went to explore and to find out, to uncover war crimes, to shoot these pictures of war crimes, and then also British journalists who came to uncover the actual concentration camps, like Ed Williami from The Guardian and Penny Marshall from ITN News, which is really amazing. So they did obviously the right thing. But on the other hand, you had these journalists who just sort of, maybe not maliciously, maybe not all of them knew what they were doing, but they bought into the state propaganda that was being sold to them. Instead of questioning it, they just bought into it and accepted it as it is. And when they went to interview these people who were living, who were being imprisoned in concentration camps and being tortured and beaten, and you could see that, a man who looks like he's literally skin and bones and hasn't eaten in weeks and has bruises all over his body, to accept that this is just a refugee camp or a prison of war camp, whatever they wanted to call it, is sort of really magnificent, because it takes a lot to just take politicians at their word. And so, yeah, there was a lot of journalists that did the right thing, but there were so many that really just acted like a Milosevic's and Mladic's and Karadzic's mouthpiece. And that spread the propaganda.
And when did this, and how did this, do you think that the nationalist movement, their trajectory got more and more extreme? Was it because nobody was stopping them at that time, or just the religious fervor? What was that led to that extreme, those extreme actions?
There was, I think the main thing was the fear mongering. People really did genuinely start to sort of feel afraid. And I think fear is such a great emotion to really take advantage of. You put enough fear into people and you can really make them do whatever you want. One specific thing that I found in my research is actually the Serbian leadership spoke openly about the difficulty that they found in turning the people of Bosnia against each other. Because beyond Serbia, beyond Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia was really the most multi-ethnic. Yes, we were majority Muslim, of course, but Serbs who were Christian Orthodox, Croats who are Roman Catholics, Jewish people, Roma, atheists, agnostics, everybody just sort of lived in peace for such a long time, and it sort of got accustomed to each other, that yes, they talked about how much effort they actually had to put into. So they had to have this propaganda on repeat to really convince people to buy into it, which I think is the possibly the scariest thing of it all, in my opinion. Why it sort of became so extreme? One part of it is nobody took it seriously enough.
Yeah.
Even in places like Croatia and Bosnia, people were
Mm.
still sort of convinced that this could not happen here.
Mm.
People were used to peace. People were used to, nobody ever thinks that your neighbor is going to turn against
Going
you.
against you.
Different faith. So I think people were sort of shell-shocked. And nobody in the Western world and in the international community in specific was taking it seriously. They did the whole ancient ethnic hatreds thing, which
Mm.
any serious academic who researches that region and the history of it will tell you is completely you know bollocks. Basically, it's nonsense. It's not a real thing. Ancient ethnic hatreds is not really the gist of what this war was about. This war was about greater Serbia expansionism, which utilized Islamophobia
Mm.
and ethno-nationalism to really gain their sort of territorial goals, and to cleanse this area and to make it this sort of pure greater Serbian state.
Can I ask you a question? Did the national film industry play any role in this as well? Because this is something that I have never, or like, haven't seen many people talk about, how film was used in, perhaps, was that part of the propaganda?
Not so much at the time. The sort of film industry in Yugoslavia at the time was very sort of partisan.
Okay.
So it was still this sort of remnant of Tito's Yugoslavia, which was sort of about, equality and brotherhood and unity. There wasn't much about it then, but during the war and after,
Mhm.
there was definitely films that sort of justified
Mhm.
the all sides are equally culpable
Mhm.
and we weren't really that bad. And so the film industry did play a huge role into it, I would say, after the fact,
After the
but
fact.
not so much. The one way I think a positive way that the film industry sort of played a role, and I would say not film industry, but more of the entertainment industry at large, is, for example, in places like Sarajevo, where they really banded sort of together and they produced art to criticize Milosevic and criticize the war, which I think was the most wonderful thing. In fact, one of the really interesting things about the breakup and really the war and genocide is that a lot of the most outspoken critics of Milosevic and a lot of the most ardent anti-war and anti-genocide activists from the Serbian side, but as well as sort of all over Yugoslavia, were artists and creative sort of people, which was really, really amazing.
Interesting. Um, as we're talking about extreme nationalism, and we know that that and fascism go hand in hand. Um, so, how did it intertwine in Bosnia, which eventually led to the genocide? Could you? And I know this is part of, this is what you research. Um, can you frame that for us?
Yeah, so, again, we go back to the greater Serbia expansionism and this sort of seeking out of this ethnically pure Serb state where, they're going from village to village, town to town, municipality to municipality, and they are either outright murdering people, putting them in concentration camps. They're putting the women in rape camps. One huge component was these rape camps where women were just tortured and sexually violated on a daily, ongoing basis, to dehumanize them and then eventually to either murder them or to forcibly sort of drive them out of that area. The way fascism works is that it picks a specific target and uses that as a way to basically get to its goals. So it didn't really matter. For Serbia, I don't think it necessarily mattered who the victims were. We could have been anybody. It's just with the Bosniak Muslims, there was history there. We were Muslims, and in many ways, they saw us as the descendants, or it depends. Either they saw us as the descendants of the Turks, and therefore, because the Ottoman empires ruled that area for a certain amount of years, we deserved what we got because we were Ottomans and therefore occupiers. That was just an excuse, because the other component of that is that they viewed us as fellow Slavs, but we were traitors because we were Muslim.
Oh, okay.
So there was this huge component of dehumanization. And I think that's the number one thing when it comes to fascism. It is always going to find an other. It is always going to target that other. And it doesn't matter what that other is. It matters that they get enough people to either fear or hate the other. Because if they can focus their intention of their people on hating that other or hating that specific target, well, then they can get away with whatever crimes they're committing. And obviously, corruption and crime is a huge component of fascism as well.
And how much of this was inspired by the Holocaust?
I think a lot, especially about like the concentration camps. And even when we look at it, there was times where they openly sort of recorded themselves committing war crimes, executing people. There's, openly talking about, murdering Muslims, taking the city back from the Turks, or the Balia, which is a derogatory term for, Bosniak Muslims. But I think they thought that they were clever enough that they wouldn't get caught. And I think they also, one component, again, of fascism, I think, is self-victimization. They convinced themselves and their people that they were actually the victims, and what they were doing was righteous. And it was, payback for acts of atrocities that took place in, 300 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever. So I think... Oh, no, go ahead.
I was wondering if that is the thought process still. What do Serbs think about Bosniaks now? How do they, what is the society there now? What does it look like now? Is there trade between the two? If you could share that.
Well, one, it's difficult because, we can talk about Serbs in Serbia, and we can talk about the Serbs in Bosnia. The biggest issue with how the war and the genocide unfolded in Bosnia is that the Serbs were eventually really rewarded with their own identity. So they had just spent, 4 years killing people and murdering them in Bosnia and doing all sorts of atrocities. And, the Dayton Accords came, and they signed a document basically giving them that land that they just ethnically cleansed this stuff. So now Bosnia is split into, two separate entities, the Bosniak Croat Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Republika Srpska. And in Republika Srpska, it's not genocide denialism, it's genocide celebration, it's triumphalism, it's the celebration of people like Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, Milosevic. It's glorification of the war criminals. If I go to places like Banja Luka, I can regularly expect that people will wave three fingers at me, that people will basically have Ratko Mladic shirts. They have these huge celebrations in their honor, like parties in their honor around the time that we are burying our loved ones 25 years after the fact. So it's a complicated question. Naturally, not every single Serbian person is like that, nor would I ever, make such a sort of insinuation. In Serbia itself, it's a bit different. I think in many ways they feel like it's in the past, we should forget about it, we should move on with our lives. But again, even in Serbia, there's a huge ethno-nationalist component of society that is really, really dictating the rules. I mean, the current president of Serbia is Aleksandar Vučić, who in the 90s said something like, "For every Serb, we will kill 100 Muslims." So there is a sort of celebration of it. There's a sort of constant, ongoing genocide denialism. But there are also a huge amount of Serbs who are working really hard to bridge those divides, to sort of express solidarity. And I know things are really difficult for them as well. I have a great many of Serbian friends. We have human rights organizations in Serbia themselves, like the Foundation of Human Rights in Serbia. The Youth Foundation of Human Rights in Serbia works tirelessly to confront genocide denialism and to really get the rest of the Serbian population to admit that genocide did take place in Bosnia. And women, the Women in Black is also a Belgrade-based group of women who've been protesting against this war and against the genocide really since the 90s. Every single year, they go to Srebrenica. They stand there in solidarity with the victims at a great threat to their own safety, because they are, despite the fact that they're Serbian, because they're standing in solidarity with the Bosniaks, they're targeted and they're harassed, and they've been subjected to all sorts of violence. So we have a really long way to go, but we won't go anywhere all while we have people like Aleksandar Vučić and Milorad Dodik, who is the president of Republika Srpska entity, who they are using that ethno-nationalism, Dodik especially, in Bosnia itself. I mean, he specifically is using the nationalism and denies the genocide. And even in places like Srebrenica, where the worst of the genocide happened, the mayor there is Serbian and denies that the genocide occurred.
I've heard that the museum is also under attack over there, that there are efforts to close it down or rename it. Can you share something about that? And is that part of the effort to deny the genocide?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, currently, I think the Potocari Memorial Center, I think, has always been under attack. And they do, phenomenal work in preserving the memory, and they're really expanding on sort of including more research-based information as well, which is, I think, going to be really effective. But in places like Prijedor, for example, there isn't a memorial center there because it's in the Republika Srpska entity, and the Serbian government the Republika Srpska, basically the Serbian leadership, will not allow it. In places like Visegrad, where there is a monument, once again, to the victims of Visegrad, the over 3,000, 4,000 people that were murdered in just the span of 3 months, they did get to build a center, but the Serbs then came, like the ethno-nationalist Serbs, the Chetniks, they came and they tried to demolish it, right? So it's ongoing battle for being allowed to mourn, being allowed to grieve, being allowed to tell our stories, to tell the truth. Nobody's really paying attention to it anymore because the war is over and the Dayton Agreement has been signed. So I think everybody sort of assumes that, things are fine. There's no war. There has been no revenge killings. There's been no ongoing conflict. Well, the conflict is still there. For me, the genocide never really ended. It's ongoing with their denialism, with their sort of celebration and worshiping, really, of these war criminals. It is completely ongoing. It's a direct daily attack on the victims and the survivors of the genocide.
And do you think it could spill beyond those borders if it's contained within that specific area, or are you
Oh,
seeing signs of it
absolutely.
spilling over?
I think I don't think it will happen anytime soon. That doesn't mean it will
Mm,
never happen again. I don't like to fearmonger. I think people are tired of war, and I think that's the
mm,
main reason that it won't happen. But what concerns me is that we now have younger generations who I think are becoming even more ethno-nationalists than the generations prior to them. Especially in the diaspora, people who have never really
mm,
been impacted by war, they're learning hatred either directly from politicians or from their parents.
mm,
I think that sort of hatred could have an effect, down the line. But right now, I'm not worried about a war or a genocide happening right now. I know
mhm.
some other people are. I just think people are tired. They want stability, they want peace, they want justice, they want their grief to be acknowledged. I think that's the biggest thing.
Well, we have listeners thanking you for all of that information. One of the other listeners was commenting that this is something that he feels is this narrative is repeating in places like India, where it used to be ethnic and multi faith, pluralistic society, but has changed in the past couple of years.
Hmm.
And there's one of the things that that has been reported that the a first big component of social changes was under the communist regime, the government. And so I wanted, if you could perhaps touch on what developed the development of communism in Yugoslavia, how did that affect the Bosniak population? And we've heard Quranic schools were affected, charitable foundations established by Muslims and religious orders. So, was that one of the warning signs?
I don't necessarily think so because I think Yugoslavia is a bit complex. I think World War II and the Holocaust is a very, I think, difficult sort of conversation to have in just like a small period of time because
Mhm.
you had a huge amount of different sort of separatist groups and some of them were Nazi aligned, some of them were sort of trying to stay out of it. And then you had the Yugoslav partisans come and they sort of united all of these people. Now, a lot of the fascists and the Chetniks who committed, murders during World War II were under the communist regime were tried or executed and all, and that's great. But what Tito really tried to do was sort of prevent that ethno-nationalism from happening again. Where he sort of, I think, made a mistake is that rather than allowing Bosniaks their own ethnic identity as Bosniaks, to sort of placate the other groups, he allowed them to identify as Muslims,
Mm,
which I think definitely played a part. There is obviously, we're talking about a socialist, country, so atheism or agnosticism was the preference. However, while Tito had many flaws, there is, I think, a sort of over focus on that. I don't think it
mhm,
really stemmed from his reign, at least. I think, in fact, the way he did things certainly kept everybody peaceful and happy. There was obviously lots of issues with various groups in terms of religious identification, but it was more in terms of publicly identifying as. Now you're going to get different things from different people in different areas. My family is really religious
mhm,
and very conservative Muslim, and they have been, since forever. In
mhm,
including during Tito's Yugoslavia. And they themselves, will say, we never had any problems. Whereas there are, case studies of Muslims in other areas being reported by, other Bosniaks for, being too religious or preaching or stuff like that. And that was something that was really common across all three. So I don't think it was a specific thing where the Muslim identity was under attack. It was this sort of idealism of, nobody should be religious. But when you cut people off from religion, you don't necessarily get those results. You get people who want to even, cling to it even more, which can obviously cause further issues. I don't see that communism played the part. I think communism and socialism and actually the leadership of Tito really sort of helped stifle the tensions that had been that could have spilled over from World War II, because the focus suddenly became on socioeconomic betterment, and I think that's what everybody's goal was. But once Tito died, that was part of it. That escalated things, and you suddenly saw an uptick really in anti-Muslim sentiment, not just for the Bosniaks, but really for the Albanians as well, because obviously there was a huge ethnic cleansing program in Kosovo. And so, this was, it's difficult to really pinpoint it, but I think for a fact, we can say that in the 80s, it's definitely when things really started to sort of brew. And it was really under Milosevic who sort of took a very right-wing stance of the socialist sort of, rather than going where Tito was going, he sort of went on his own and took a right-wing nationalistic stance in leading the country, which inevitably led to people saying, no, we don't want to be part of this anymore. We want to be our own, our independent state.
Tell us more about your book, Letters from the Diaspora.
So I wrote that book. It's a collection of 12 short stories. It was something I wrote fairly quickly, but it was based off of all of these conversations that I would have with my friends and people that I would sort of meet at Bosnian gatherings, sometimes in mosques, sometimes in, a shisha bar or a concert or whatever it was. People tend to open up to me. I've noticed that. And so I treat their stories very carefully in a way, and I sort of hold them very close to my heart. But I had this idea, it was around the 20th anniversary of the Bosnian Genocide, that I would take some of these stories and I would, write them into sort of short prose that will explore really the trauma that we dealt with as refugees, as genocide survivors, and just everything from, witnessing the atrocities, from losing our loved ones, from having to be forced from our homes and be in this foreign land where we really were, most of us came with absolutely nothing. My own family, we had maybe, I think, $50 when we came to the United States. And I think that was the case for pretty much all the other Bosnian refugees that I know. So in a way, I wanted to tell their stories in a short and concise way that, I wanted to bring out the emotion of it, really, not just the facts, because the facts they get to say on a daily basis. And this was a more creative and healing way of me dealing with that myself through telling other people's stories of, being a refugee and being a Muslim and being a victim of genocide and being in this foreign land and not really fully healed from all the trauma. So my hope is that
in the Midwest, right? You grew up in Iowa.
I did. Yes. I came over I was 2002. 2002. Yeah, I left Bosnia for the first time. So I did, I always say I was raised in Sarajevo, but then I realized that I spent a long time in Iowa. So the Midwest is a huge part of me, and I have such a soft the entire time that I lived there, I was like, I have to go back home and I have to move back. But now I'm like, oh no, I love it. I miss it so much.
That's beautiful. I wanted to, as we're wrapping up the hour, I really would like to pull from your research, your experience, the work that just hearing from survivors. What lessons would you give to, or sort of have you taken from your studies that we can as we're looking at the United States right now, and we see a rise in fascism, with journalism going down the drain, with with extreme right wing, neo Nazis popping, and white supremacists. This is all happening in the United States as we're speaking. So I really want to learn, and I hope our audience can learn about the warnings of a possible nationalism-fueled, fervor here. And yeah, so.
I mean, yeah, me and lots of my own colleagues from the Balkans, from former Yugoslavia, have, I feel like, been warning almost for years now about, the sort of rise of fascist ideology in the United States, the Trumpism of it all, his behavior, the fact that journalists are not calling him out. All of these things play a huge, huge part. How can we prevent that?
Mm-hmm.
The protests are a great way. People are speaking out now more than ever, which I think is immensely important. People are standing together. I think, I'm in my 30s, obviously, but I don't think I've ever seen such an expression of solidarity as I have in the last, I would say, year, which has been phenomenal. Since Trump has come on, I think that's the one benefit. People are standing in solidarity a lot more. One thing is, I think, we are already on that way. We have gotten to the classification. Trump has made his targets very clear, and they have been immigrants, they have been Muslims, they've been Black people, they've been women. So we have gotten to we're already there at that first step. There's also the dehumanization. We have seen that over and over in the media by politicians, not just by Trump, by politicians that support him, by media that supports him. There is constant dehumanizing language about Muslims, about immigrants and refugees and Black people, and really, communities of color and marginalized people in general are under a constant daily attack. The media has to put a stop to this. They have to call this behavior out. They have to write about it with fervor. They have to write about it with honesty. They cannot just take politicians at their word. They can't take the police at their word. What I will tell you is that in Bosnia, police and military were the number one sort of perpetrators of the genocide. So take that with a grain of salt. People in positions of power tend to side with whoever is at the top, which right now is Trump. You have to really constantly, empathetically be conscious of the fact that what is happening right now isn't abnormal. It is something that's happened before. And the only thing that you can do is learn from what happened before, which means speak out against it, mobilize, talk to your friends, call out your family. I do it with, the people that I love. I have arguments or discussions, and, they're not racist or, fascist or anything, but I call them out for slight, ignorant comments too, because it really starts with that. And it doesn't mean, you go and you yell at them. Talk to them with love, approach it with love. Everything that we do to protect our communities, we have to start from a place of love. We don't fight for justice out of hate or revenge. We fight for justice because we love, and we fight for the right thing because we love. So, I think there are very indeed scary times in the United States. A part of me is really glad that I've left.
I
And
know things have changed so
things are
rapidly.
here.
It is. Things have changed so rapidly in the past, and I feel like before a lot of things were perhaps the war was overseas, and then there was a war on the streets as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the war on the streets has expanded, and so that is something that people are and I think the Corona, the virus, putting a stop. This whole machine running, that whole, you're on a treadmill and just running, and not taking a chance to take a breather and seeing what is happening in my society. That has given America time, this Corona has given a time for us to take a step back and see, oh my God, this is really happening.
Yeah.
And so it's been an awakening, if nothing else.
Yeah.
But I'm really grateful. We've run out of time, but I'm really grateful for you to be here, and we learned a lot from you. We'd love to have you back. This is something that we can't talk enough about, because until we learn from these lessons, history is going to repeat itself. So Thank you so much, Arnesa. And thank you to everybody on Muslim Network TV for watching us. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.